All right, everyone, it is that time again. Welcome to another exciting video about religion and film. I'm Dr. Andrew Coates, and this video is going to be pretty long, and I'll warn you up front. That's because it's looking at the early history of Hollywood and how religion showed up in some of the earliest days of film in America. And as a historian of religion in the United States, this is actually some of my favorite stuff to think about when it comes to religion and film. Because as it turns out, studying the history of where film comes from, how it developed, and how religious people responded to film when it was a new technology, I think we can actually gain really important perspective on why things are the way they are today in the landscape of religion and film. Now, that being said, obviously there's lots of differences between the early days of movies and today, but by looking into the past, I think we'll see that some of the same concerns have shaped people's religious responses to film from the late 1800s and persist to this very day. So here's a couple of things that I hope you'll take away from this video. I mean, the first is a recognition that films have always navigated or created several different audiences at the same time. So, right, in one sense, Hollywood movies are for everyone. In another sense, films about religion often have particular audiences that they're trying to appeal to. So Hollywood films with religious ambitions have always had to navigate that tension between mass appeal and then specific concerns of specific religious audiences. Early films, it turns out, performed just as complicated negotiations with different religious communities as films and filmmakers do today. There's never just one audience for a film. There's always been many audiences that films have been navigating as they're also creating those audiences. Another thing to say is that, historically speaking, religious support and opposition to film has actually taken many different forms. Some religious communities have had concerns about the morality of specific dialogue or specific images. Other religious communities had concerns about film because of their understandings of the morality of entertainment more generally. And then in other times and places, the specific context or physical location where people viewed films became a source of religious attention or concern. So the big lesson is that we can't just look at a film's words or messages and assume too much about its reception in religious communities. The story is much, much more complicated than that. The history of religion and early film should draw our attention to unusual parts of the world of film, like the fact that simply because a technology exists, that doesn't tell us what people are actually going to do with that technology. There are lots of things that American society could have done with motion pictures, but we've ended up in a world where we all think watching a movie means something really quite specific. And the very early history of Hollywood should draw our attention to the physical ways we engage with movies, because some of the strange ways people wanted to watch motion pictures in the past created unique issues and new opportunities for the technologies of filmmaking, but also for religion to find a place to operate in a different way in American society. So to understand religious concerns about the morality of film, both in the past and today, we need to think about the entire movie watching experience and how that came into being. So, despite what some people might want to say, there was no miraculous birth moment for film that happened at just one instance in time. The technology of capturing motion pictures and playing recorded sounds came from several sources. And the practices associated with watching films and consuming films as entertainment came likewise from several different sources in American culture. And I've said this already in one way, and I want to say it again because I think it's super important. The mere existence of a particular technology didn't dictate how people were actually going to use that technology. There was absolutely nothing natural or necessary about the rise of Hollywood or modern movies, or especially the modern forms of movie watching as we know them. There was nothing natural or necessary about any of that. Motion picture technology could have been used for any number of different purposes, and frankly, in the early days, people often did really surprising things with motion pictures, recorded sounds, and projectors. So to give you a sense of what was happening before film, long before film as such existed, Americans were quite accustomed to gathering together in public venues to watch shows where they looked at projected images and especially projected photographs. By the middle of the 1800s, traveling speakers were going around to exhibition halls and churches all around the country, and they would conduct lectures on a variety of topics. Often they would bring with them a device called a magic lantern, which was basically an 1800s version of a slide projector. And these traveling lecturers would show photographs and then talk about them. Often they would show scenes of faraway or exotic places, and it was especially popular with American audiences to show scenes of images with strong religious associations, such as images of the Holy Land, or the ancient ruins of Egypt, or the massive old churches of Europe. Later, when the phonograph record player was invented, traveling lecturers would often bring this device with them to display for their audiences. And the phonograph was really just one of the first machines capable of recording and playing back sounds. So a lecturer would often bring this device with them, and in front of an audience they would explain how the machine worked, and then they would do a live demonstration. They would pick somebody out of the audience, record them saying something or maybe singing, and then play their voice back to them on the phonograph device. And audiences loved these things. They loved both magic lantern shows and phonograph lectures. And for our purposes, the interesting thing to note is that moralists generally found nothing problematic about any of this. All of this stuff was considered pretty high-class entertainment, something like the edutainment of the late 1800s. And that was a big deal because American society at the time was deeply concerned about the morality of entertainment, and so magic lantern lectures and phonograph lectures were widely accepted as morally upstanding, classy, informative entertainment. What I find most interesting is that sometimes, in a few cases, traveling lecturers seem to have used both of these devices together. So before film existed, people were gathering together to look at projected pictures and to hear recorded sounds in large public venues. This type of entertainment, these lectures, these magic lantern lectures or phonograph lectures, often took place in churches because churches were often the most suitable type of public building for such events in a particular town or a particular neighborhood. And so while religious groups often get unfairly characterized as being behind the times, most of them really didn't, in principle, oppose film or its cultural antecedents in magic lantern shows or phonograph lectures just because they were new technologies. Religious communities, by and large, usually didn't reject film as such just because it was a new technology. And in fact, like most Americans of that time and today, they generally liked things that were new, mostly because they were new. So the big point is this: when the movie watching experience as we know it today developed in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was building on things that Americans were already doing. People were already gathering in big public venues to look at projected pictures and listen to recorded sounds as part of an audience. Before they even had movies to watch, Americans were already being entertained in ways remarkably similar to what movies would later provide. One of the earliest devices capable of capturing motion with photography was something called the zoopraxiscope. And it was developed in the late 1870s by this eccentric inventor named Edward Muybridge. Muybridge was a British photographer who immigrated to the United States, and for years he had been tinkering with ways to try to capture motion using still photography. And Muybridge had this theory that if you took a bunch of photographs quickly enough, then stitched them back together and viewed them in a rapid sequence, you might be able to capture motion using normal photographic cameras. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point that photography itself was still a relatively new technology at this time in history. The invention of photography usually gets dated to 1839, when the technology was first exhibited publicly in France, but it really wasn't until a couple of decades later, in the 1850s and 60s, that camera technologies and photographic techniques developed to the point where they were even remotely good enough to do things like capture an image in the fraction of a second that you would need to be able to capture motion. So Muybridge's ideas about capturing motion using still photography, like the guy himself, they were a little bit quirky for their time. Now, despite his quirks, Muybridge's experiments with multi-camera or multiple shutter motion photography came to the attention of a railroad tycoon named Leland Stanford, who is the founder of Stanford University. Stanford owned several expensive racehorses, like most rich people at the time did, I guess, but he thought he could gain a competitive advantage in horse racing if he knew a little bit more about horse motion, like how does a horse actually move. And until this point in history, people had only ever seen what the human eye itself could see. So if you watch with unaided eyes as a horse runs, what the human eye itself sees is blurry legs, right? If you watch a horse running at full gallop, you just see blurriness. And to the naked eye, a running horse looks like it's floating in the air. But that seems impossible because horses are big, big animals. So most people in the 1800s thought that it must just be an optical illusion of some kind. Like something as big as a horse couldn't actually leave the ground when it's running at full speed. That sounded crazy to most people. And if you look at images of horses that were painted prior to the age of motion photography, most painters had depicted galloping horses with their front legs fully extended all the way to the front and their rear legs extended kind of all the way to the back. But crucially, at least one of the horse's feet was always shown touching the ground. Stanford was of the opinion that horses actually did leave the ground while they were running, and he wanted to be able to prove it. So he sponsored Muybridge's quirky photography research to help confirm his theory. And Muybridge really developed a pretty ingenious solution to capture photographs of a horse running at full speed. Basically what he did is he lined up a bunch of cameras along a racetrack, and then he put thin threads all the way across the track. And the idea was that the threads would trigger each camera's shutter in succession as the horse ran through the threads. So this meant that the cameras could take a really rapid succession of photographs along the racetrack as the horse was running. And then back in his lab, Muybridge could stitch the pictures from all the cameras back together. When he did this, he would put them on the inside of an open drum, and as it spun around, a person could look into the wheel and see the illusion of motion. So he called this device the zoopraxiscope because it captured the motion of animals. And also, frankly, because he was extremely pretentious and he thought the device needed a very fancy-sounding name to be taken seriously by the scientific community. So he called it the zoopraxiscope. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that people have probably known since ancient times how to use a sequence of drawn images to create the illusion of motion. What we today would describe as animation is a much, much older technology than the technology of motion picture photography. People were already doing that kind of thing in Muybridge's time. And really, Muybridge's big innovation was just that he took the basic principles of animation that people already knew and then blended them with some new processes and techniques of taking photographs. And this really was a major technological breakthrough in its time for a couple of reasons. One was it proved that still photographs could actually be used to capture motion. Before Muybridge, people really weren't sure if that was even possible. Second, these experiments were quite important because they allowed people to see things that the human eye normally couldn't see, like the fact that a horse really does leave the ground and suspend in the air for a fraction of a second when it's running at full speed. So in other words, Muybridge's experiments with motion picture photography proved that Leland Stanford was right. And what's maybe most important to note about this, at least for our purposes in this video, is that Muybridge saw himself primarily as a scientist. So the subjects of his zoopraxiscope films were mostly scientific in nature, and they were just really attempts to document different animals moving around in different ways. So he'd film like a horse walking, and then that same horse running, and maybe that same horse jumping over a fence. Or he'd film a bird flying, that kind of stuff. I should also tell you, in this vein, he made a lot, and I mean like a lot, of films of naked people doing unfathomably mundane things, like just walking around or running or doing laps on stairs, jumping up and down, doing jumping jacks, using an axe. Like, I'm not even kidding, he made a film starring himself in which he walks up one side of a seesaw and then down the other side while he is completely nude. He's a legend. As it pertains to religion, Muybridge's zoopraxiscope gave a hint at something that would become ultimately a perennial part of religious groups' moral concerns about film. And that was that once the genie of motion photography was let out of the bottle, it stirred up a little bit of controversy about the new kinds of vision that this new technology was opening up. In other words, in the wake of these new scientific discoveries, some religious people started wondering, should human beings actually be seeing the stuff that film lets us see now? Does this technology maybe open up access to a God's eye view of the world, maybe unlocking strange or terrible new kinds of vision? Should humans perhaps be limited to seeing what we can normally see with our unaugmented eyes? Or should we use this new technology to unlock some of the mysteries of the universe? There really were no clear answers at the time, and the technologies of filmmaking were developing very, very rapidly. What I can tell you is that by and large, religious groups in the United States tended to embrace film rather than reject it. They saw it as an exciting new technology that they might be able to put to use in their own communities for religious purposes. By and large, most religious groups in the United States did not just reject film because it was a new technology or because even some of the things it showed people were a little bit scary. Another major breakthrough technology in the early history of motion pictures was the kinetoscope, which was first publicly exhibited in 1893. The kinetoscope was one of the first true motion picture devices that generated commercially successful films. So in other words, the primary purpose of most kinetoscope films was entertainment rather than scientific investigation. The kinetoscope was developed by Thomas Edison, the famous scientific showman and entrepreneur who also patented the incandescent light bulb and the phonograph record player, among many, many other devices. The kinetoscope was essentially a large cabinet with a loop of photographic film inside it. And each roll of film had hundreds or even thousands of still photographs laid out in a sequence, and they were all attached together on a continuous reel. So this marked a major improvement over the Muybridge process, in part because it used a new kind of camera that was specifically designed to capture motion on moving reels of film. And with this new technology, filmmakers were no longer limited to just a few photographs capturing maybe a second or two of motion. The kinetoscope camera could be pointed at a moving subject and then follow its motion as it happened, giving a much more natural look and feel to films on the kinetoscope. The viewer of kinetoscope films also benefited from more than just a few frames of action, because this meant that movies could get a little longer, and the motions that were capable of being captured on kinetoscopes were a little more complex than the motions that Muybridge could capture on his zoopraxiscope. Now, I should say, the change wasn't exactly entirely earth-shattering. An early kinetoscope was only capable of holding a maximum of about 50 feet of film on its reels. So depending on the frame rate, which was a new term that was developed to describe how fast an individual photograph on the loop actually moved past the viewing window, depending on the frame rate, early kinetoscope films could be about 20 seconds long. Some films with slightly slower frame rates looked a little choppier, but they could last as long as maybe 40 seconds. Eventually, improvements to the kinetoscope's internals allowed them to show slightly longer films, but even by the end of the kinetoscope period, we're generally talking about films that lasted around 1 to 2 minutes or so. The way people watched kinetoscopes was usually at kinetoscope parlors, and the first kinetoscope parlor in America opened on Broadway in New York City in 1894. It quickly became a very popular attraction. At a kinetoscope parlor like the one on Broadway, people typically paid 25 cents to view all of the films in one half of a room, or they'd pay 50 cents to watch all the films on all the kinetoscopes in an entire room. And this was a pretty decent amount of money to spend on entertainment in the 1890s. It wasn't prohibitively expensive, but it was a decent amount of money. Audiences then, because of the prices and because of what was on offer, flocked to the new picture shows as a form of entertainment. And one of the most important developments of the kinetoscope was that it made clear that there was a major market to be found for films that were strictly a source of entertainment. Films, in other words, were starting to become mostly about having fun or being entertained. They weren't just going to be research tools used by scientists or wealthy business people. And something I find especially striking to notice today about the kinetoscope is that it involved one viewer watching a film through a viewing portal in a large cabinet. So to watch a kinetoscope film, you had to go to a special room with all of these devices in it. And there was certainly a social element to that, but it was also a surprisingly individualized viewing environment. People looked into a viewing portal and watched movies by themselves. And this image that's on the screen right now, I think, really demonstrates how highly individualized the experience of viewing a kinetoscope could actually be. On the screen is a picture of a man using a kinetoscope somewhere in America around 1895. I think it's very probable that this is actually a promotional image created by the Edison Company to advertise the kinetoscope and show people what it could do. And the reason I suspect that this might be a promotional image is that it's just like a little bit too staged. This is clearly not a real kinetoscope parlor. This is just the machine by itself in an empty room in front of a fake background. And it's a little too convenient that we can see this guy very clearly from the side as he's watching the movie. This image, I think, is really meant to show viewers how to use this new device. Here's what you do with it. Here's how it looks if you're using this device properly. And nonetheless, even if it's staged, I think this is a really fascinating window into just how deeply individual the early kinetoscope viewing experience was. And what's especially interesting about this image on the vein of individualization is that the man watching this film is not just looking through a private viewing portal to watch a film by himself. He's also wearing listening tubes. Listening tubes were essentially the 1890s version of headphones. And I just think that's really, really amazing. Because we probably think of watching videos while wearing headphones as something really new and modern. And I'm sorry to say that's just flat out wrong. As I mentioned earlier, Edison was the inventor, or at least the patent holder, of the phonograph device, which could play recorded music and recorded voices. So it made sense for him, as a business person, as an entrepreneur, to pair that type of device with the moving pictures on his kinetoscope, to give audiences the kind of entertainment they were craving. Kinetoscope viewing, in other words, was a highly immersive, individualized viewing and sometimes even an individualized listening experience. People obviously didn't have quite the same degree of input over their viewing choices as we might today as we scroll through videos on our smartphones. But I suspect early film viewers had their own favorite movies, and I'm sure many people returned to the same kinetoscope cabinet over and over again to watch their favorite movies. So they certainly had more individual control over their viewing choices than we might have realized. Films for the early kinetoscope were mostly made by Edison and his associates at the Edison Company, and they were filmed at a studio nicknamed the Black Maria Studio. The Black Maria Studio was gigantic, even by the standards of the time. It was essentially the size of a small apartment, and it sat on a giant rotating track so that it could be spun in different directions to achieve different effects with light. And this was one of the most crucial innovations of kinetoscope filmmaking. It allowed filmmakers to carefully control and manipulate light. The studio had a hinge that allowed the roof to be raised and lowered, allowing more or less light into a shot as the situation dictated. The goal of most of the films shot at the Black Maria Studio was to be entertaining, interesting, and different enough from each other to entice viewers to splurge and pay the extra 25 cents to watch the shows on both sides of the kinetoscope parlor. So the subjects of these early films were often things like dances, boxing matches, strongman shows, funny animal tricks, or circus performances such as trapeze acts or jugglers. So I'm going to put one on the screen right now. Let's watch one. Let's prepare to be entertained 1890s style. That's it, folks. I hope you feel like you got your 25 cents worth. I mean, while it might surprise us today, people in the 1890s really loved these movies, and more importantly, the kinetoscope proved that film could thrive in American society as mostly just a mode of entertainment. Its role in scientific research would never really go away, and films are still used for these purposes today. Think of the super slow motion, super high definition cameras that scientists use when they're doing research. I mean, film is still an important part of scientific research, but it became clear once the kinetoscope arrived on the scene that the future of film in American culture was mostly going to be tied to entertainment. Now to the piece about religion. Think about the way that people watched early kinetoscopes. So a viewer would go into a room with a bunch of high-tech fancy machines in them. They had to pay to enter the room and use the devices inside, so there was something sort of exclusive or intriguing about the experience of stepping into that viewing parlor. And then once they were ready, a viewer would place their face into a shield that darkened the room and let them privately watch a motion picture. And maybe they also had listening tubes in their ears, giving them an even more fully immersive auditory and visual experience. And what they were watching was technologically innovative. It let you see things that you couldn't normally see. So this practice of viewing kinetoscopes in the semi-private space of the viewing box, coupled with the new things that film technologies were allowing people to see, that combination was enough to make some viewers quite uncomfortable. And religiously based attempts at censorship very quickly struck the kinetoscope device. One early film in particular set off a small furor, let's say, in its local community when it came out. In 1894, a Spanish dancer and performer nicknamed Carmencita recorded a film at the Black Maria Studio. Her film eventually made its way into the kinetoscope parlor that was located at Asbury Park, which was a new amusement park that had recently opened in New Jersey. When local Protestant Christian leaders caught wind of the film Carmencita and heard that it was being showed at Asbury Park, they demanded that it be removed from the park's kinetoscope parlor. Local government officials got involved, they watched the movie, and they agreed that the content was a little too salacious for the respectable viewing public. So Carmencita was quickly removed from the parlor and replaced with another film. Carmencita seems to have prompted one of the earliest instances of religiously based censorship of a film. At least it's one of the earliest religiously based attempts at censorship of a film that I've been able to track down and document. So, to figure out why that's the case, let's watch Scandalous. I know. I hope this video doesn't cause my video to get taken down or flagged on YouTube or something, right? It might not seem like much to us today, but Carmencita set off a moral outrage in its day. And why is that, right? It's not as if Americans had never seen someone dance before. On a stage, nothing about this would have been morally objectionable to most Americans at the time. However, because of how voyeuristic the experience of viewing kinetoscope films was, and because of what this film was showing, it made the movie problematic in the eyes of Christian leaders in New Jersey. On a stage, people would be watching the dancers surrounded by others as part of an audience. It would pose no moral problem because they were just watching with their unaided eyes. On a kinetoscope film, however, a viewer saw this film through the semi-private technology of the viewing portal, and they saw a dancing woman whose leg was ever so slightly exposed through the choppy frame rate of the film. As she spins, the camera seems to dwell a little too long on her legs, and a person watching the film could notice the shape of her body and her figure far more clearly than someone watching her on a stage from a distance could have noticed those things. So in short, religious leaders became concerned that this film that was being shown in a voyeuristic technological way would excite the sexual passions of young people, particularly young boys. And so it was removed from the amusement park. The Carmencita scandal, I think, gives a fascinating glimpse at some of the early religious concerns about film. And the way the problem was resolved, I think, also illustrates something fascinating about how religious groups would continue to deal with films that they didn't like for decades and even centuries to come. It was clear to most religious leaders and local politicians that Carmencita had to go. But that didn't mean that religious leaders said every film had to go, or that the kinetoscope itself was like an evil technology that needed to be burned in public. Instead of banning all films or burning kinetoscope parlors to the ground, religious and government leaders allowed the parlor to replace Carmencita with another film. So instead of getting rid of film entirely, they thought it was perfectly acceptable to replace Carmencita with something else, something that wasn't morally objectionable. And the movie that replaced Carmencita at the parlor was a film called Professor Welton's Boxing Cats. So let's watch and see what was so much better about it than Carmencita. Right? So I can't entirely confirm this, but I suspect this was one of the world's first viral cat videos. This is how religiously based censorship of films usually happened. It was almost never about a complete rejection of films on principle. Almost no religious groups in America, at least at this point in history, banned their members from watching movies entirely. Instead, the strategy of religious censorship tended to be one of replacement. Religious groups generally advocated that morally objectionable films should be removed from public view and replaced by ones that were not considered morally objectionable. So most religious Americans weren't saying that people should avoid films altogether. Rather, they were insisting that films should show good things instead of bad things. And that is a perspective that is still around to this very day. A short time later, a daring new film called The Kiss raised even more eyebrows than Carmencita did. Starring actor Mae Irwin, the film depicted the final scene from a popular play called The Widow Jones, which she had performed often in theaters around the country. It was a very popular show, she was a popular actor, and the film version of the play's final moments quickly became one of the Edison Company's most popular films of all time, probably because it was also one of the most controversial films they ever made. This movie is the first known example of a kiss being shown on screen. And almost as soon as it was released, it was widely decried as obscene material by many different religious groups. To some people, no doubt, this made the prospect of watching it on the kinetoscope even more alluring and even more interesting. But the scandal over this movie ultimately would fuel the kinetoscope's popularity and its commercial success. People, it turns out, really wanted to see this dirty stuff. So here it is. Here is The Kiss, starring Mae Irwin. Look, I get it, right? The idea that this could cause any kind of controversy is absurd by today's standards. This is very tame by contemporary standards. But in its time, this movie was very controversial, and I hope it isn't too hard to see why at this point. It had everything to do with how you actually watched a movie on the kinetoscope. The practice of an individual viewer looking through a private window to see a motion picture show made the experience far more voyeuristic than watching actors kiss on a stage during a play. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the religious outrage over the kiss and the interest that it helped ultimately generate in the kinetoscope quickly led filmmakers to explore more explicitly sexualized content that actually tried to play up the voyeurism of the kinetoscope viewing experience. Eventually, it would become the case that the kinetoscope and related devices would be used to create some of the first true pornographic films. By the mid-1890s, the French brothers Louis and Auguste Lumière started making and showing their own motion pictures using a new device called the cinematograph. Much like Edison's kinetoscope, it used moving reels of film that advanced through a camera lens to capture motion, but the cinematograph had one key advantage over the kinetoscope, and that was projection. Unlike the kinetoscope, the cinematograph was capable of projecting its motion pictures onto a large wall or a screen. So in 1895, the Lumière brothers held their first public showing of the cinematograph in Paris. Masters of publicity, they built up a ton of hype for what they were going to do, and then on December 28, 1895, they gathered an audience of Paris's movers and shakers and showed them 10 films projected onto the wall in the basement of the Grand Café in Paris. The subjects of their first films were mostly scenes of daily life in France. The Lumière brothers' films bore such descriptive titles as Workers Leaving the Lumière Factory, or The Arrival of a Train at Le Ciotat Station. And there's this long-standing myth that when the Lumière brothers showed their film of the train arriving at a station, that audiences let out a gasp of horror and thought that the train was going to come alive and jump at them through the screen and crush them. But frankly, that's complete crap. It absolutely didn't happen. Audiences did let out gasps of excitement when they watched the early Lumière films, but let's remember, it's not as if they had never seen a projected image on a wall before. They were simply mesmerized by what they were seeing and what they were experiencing, and they let out gasps of awe in amusement at how exciting they found this film to be. Cinematograph films were very quickly picked up by vaudeville theaters in France, England, and in the United States. Vaudeville really doesn't exist anymore, but it was a popular type of variety show at the turn of the 20th century. And as the name variety show implies, it involved a combination of different acts, including lots of different types of entertainers. So at a vaudeville show, you'd see singers and actors, dancers, comedians, maybe magicians, all performing short acts one after another. So you might see someone acting out a monologue from Hamlet for a few minutes, then you'd hear some singers perform a love song, then you'd see a magician do a couple of illusions, then maybe there'd be some dancers, then maybe you'd see a scene from a funny play acted out. And so short projected films were incorporated as acts into the vaudeville variety show. Now, it became very quickly from this merging of the cinematograph projection technologies and vaudeville that film's brightest future really lay as a broadcast medium for mass audiences, not just as something that individual viewers would see through a private viewing device. The success of the Lumiere brothers films really proved to everyone that the future of film was going to be something projected and public and designed to appeal to mass audiences. In the wake of the cinematograph, film technologies and the art of filmmaking developed really rapidly in the first 2 decades of the 1900s. One very important development was the emergence of Nickelodeon theaters. These were theaters that exclusively showed films. Usually they showed several short films that were played over and over again. And films themselves were becoming the main attraction that people were paying to see. A Nickelodeon theater usually cost just 5 cents to enter, hence the name, Nickelodeon. And Odeon was just a fancy old-fashioned word for theater. So from the name, we get a sense that Nickelodeons were really intended from the beginning to be cheap, accessible theaters with grander ambitions than their nickel fare might imply. After paying their nickel to enter the theater, customers could stay as long as they wanted. They could watch one film, they could watch dozens of films, whatever they chose. The projectionists usually showed a bunch of different short films in a set rotation, but they might adapt their plans and replay crowd favorites if people demanded it by clapping or by shouting at them and saying, "Hey, show our favorite thing again." The image on the screen right now is a picture of the outside of a Nickelodeon theater that operated in Detroit. This one is pictured around the year 1910. And as you can see from the sign on the outside, it shows you exactly what the draw was of Nickelodeon theaters. It says, "This is the Princess Theater. It costs 5 cents to enter, and there's popular shows going on all the time." So, because their admission prices were so low, Nickelodeon theaters usually had to set up shop in undesirable parts of town. Theater owners would pick locations usually based on how cheap the rent was, and they looked for places with either a lack of windows or with windows that could really easily be covered up for cheap to prevent light pollution from entering the space. Because they didn't cost very much to enter, Nickelodeons really helped film explode in popularity in American culture. It was during this time that film really cemented its place as a medium of mass culture and mass entertainment in American society. Nickelodeon films became extremely popular with nearly all Americans of nearly every social group because they were a form of very cheap and accessible entertainment. Their prices were accessible to almost everyone, and films became really popular, particularly among working class people and immigrants during this time in film's history. And here's where it gets really fun, I think, to think about the overlap between religion and film in the early years. Because of the physical locations where Nickelodeon theaters were located, and because their price to entry was so low that it attracted lots of different kinds of people to be watching films, Nickelodeon's quickly earned a reputation among certain Americans as dumb entertainment for the unwashed masses. In other words, films started to get a somewhat disreputable reputation. People started to think that they offered the kinds of entertainment that so-called respectable people with ambitions of upward social mobility would want to avoid in order to maintain their veneer of respectability. I'll explain more about the religious associations or implications of this in just a second. Because another important development to note at this point is that during the Nickelodeon era, films really started to become more and more like what we would recognize as movies. Films during this period started to get longer and longer and longer. First 2 minutes, then 5 minutes, then 12 minutes. By the end of the Nickelodeon era, films were approaching 30 minutes or even longer in length. So as a result of the increase in length, films became more elaborate. They started having lead actors, supporting actors, and extras. They started experimenting with more and more elaborate costumes and sets and special effects. Films during the Nickelodeon era were starting to go to ever more elaborate lengths to be entertaining and interesting to their mass audiences. And so new techniques of filmmaking were pioneered during this era, things that we now take for granted as normal aspects of movies. And the whole purpose of all of it was simply to entertain audiences who were becoming much more sophisticated viewers of film during this time. New techniques that developed were things like cross-cutting, where a film would show you two different things happening at the same time in different places. Multiple camera perspectives on a scene started to become an ordinary part of films, showing actions and then reactions from people in the same room from different perspectives. This gave a much more exciting feel to the action of a film. Likewise, close-ups emerged during this period as an important cinematic technique, focusing viewers' attentions on the intense emotions of an actor's face as they responded to events in a scene. Maybe most importantly, though, with their increasing length and popularity, films in the Nickelodeon era started to become more and more recognizable as narratives. Films now started to tell stories rather than just showing circus acts or people getting off of trains. Films now had a clear beginning, middle, and end. They followed characters who made decisions and who changed over time. They showed the consequences of characters' decisions. They showed heroes and villains, love affairs, achievements, disappointments, and struggles. They told stories about adventure, history, fantasy, romance, and crime. In their quest to attract audiences, films of the Nickelodeon era tried to tell stories that audiences wanted to see. It sounds a little bit silly today, but another major innovation of the Nickelodeon era was the use of intertitles, which were basically just text slides that explained what was happening in a scene. And these were really helpful to audiences because films of that era didn't include any sounds in their recordings. So intertitles allowed viewers to follow a plot with greater ease, to know why things were happening in a story. And that brings us to an important thing to note here. There's this misconception that films in this era were silent films, and that's certainly one fair way of describing the experience of watching them today, but it does great injustice to the reality of movie watching in Nickelodeon theaters. It was certainly true that films at this point in time didn't include spoken dialogue along with the moving pictures that they were showing, but we should definitely not imagine that the experience of watching these films was happening in total silence, like as if the audiences in Nickelodeon theater would just sit there biting their tongues the whole time. Often what happened is that the people who ran theaters and were showing the movies would play maybe recorded music as a film was showing. And sometimes this music was actually specifically recommended for use with a specific film by the film's director or by its producers or its production company. In other cases, theater operators paid live musicians to play along in the background while a motion picture show was running. Also, it was common during this time for audiences to get up and cheer and clap for their favorite scenes or their favorite films when they saw them. Maybe to demand that the projectionist show a favorite film or a favorite scene again immediately. Like, stop what you're doing and show us this again because we liked it so much. So we should imagine the experience of being in a Nickelodeon audience as something like live and loudly. These were places where people were having fun watching movies that were telling compelling stories for the first time. And people were engaged with their bodies as they watched these films. They would shout at the screen. They would gasp in horror. They would interact verbally with what was going on. So watching a silent film was almost never an actually silent experience for anybody. Some classic titles of films during the Nickelodeon era include movies like Life of an American Fireman, which is widely regarded as one of the first true movies ever made. It tells the story of a firefighter who goes to a burning building and rescues a woman and child from inside the burning building. Another classic film from the Nickelodeon era was a movie called The Great Train Robbery, which was something like the original version of movies like Scarface or The Joker. It glamorized the life and actions of a gang of train robbers in the Old West, and the end of the film contained this wild shootout between the robbers and the police, and it has this truly iconic ending that's been referenced and parodied and imitated countless times. At the ending of The Great Train Robbery, one of the robbers stares directly into the camera and then fires his pistol as if directly at the viewer. And it was very exciting. Audiences absolutely loved it, and it still sort of informs some shootout scenes today. Religious responses to films during the Nickelodeon era I find truly fascinating because they echo some modern sensibilities and laid the groundwork for some religious attitudes toward movie theaters that have never fully changed. And yet, the religious responses to Nickelodeon films were so deeply rooted in the specifics of their time and place that it's almost bizarre to think about the problem today. So among religious Americans, particularly among middle-class white Protestant American Christians, for them, Nickelodeons took on this reputation as immoral places. Part of this was because of their physical location, right? They were located in undesirable, low-rent parts of town, and these places were frequented by immigrants and working-class people. So in other words, Nickelodeon theaters had a bad reputation for being cheap, maybe classless places where fancy folk really wouldn't want to be seen. Often Nickelodeon theaters were actually just converted storefronts with like really cheap hard seats, slapped together wooden benches, that sort of thing. They were spaces that were seen as too grimy, too dirty, too disreputable for the people who wanted to be seen as respectable Protestant Christians. So another part of the theater's bad reputation was also associated with the types of films that were now being made for the first time. Films were now capable of displaying questionable moral decisions or lifestyles that people might find objectionable. Some films were seeming now to celebrate evil or to celebrate crime, to make light of figures of authority, to make you want to root for the villain. Films now were suddenly sometimes openly exciting people's sexual desires by showing romantic relationships or forbidden sexual encounters. Above all, though, for religious Americans at least, Nickelodeons were perceived as morally threatening because of the social situations they created. These were dark spaces lit mostly by the light of a projector. and they were popular gathering places for people of diverse and varied social backgrounds, places where recent immigrants and middle-class kids could meet each other and mingle, places where young women and men also mingled freely at a time when mixed-gender social gatherings in public were still somewhat taboo. And because film was still a brand new technology, and the idea of going to movie theaters for entertainment was still a new social experiment, these theaters appealed especially to young people. So Nickelodeons were spaces where mixed-gendered, mixed social status groups of young people were gathering together in low-rent parts of town in the dark. And we know what young people do to each other in these kinds of dark settings. So the physical and social characteristics of Nickelodeon theaters as physical spaces made religious audiences extremely concerned and skeptical about the moral value of film. As far as many people were concerned, simply going to watch a film meant going to a morally corrupt physical place. And a lot of religious people started to say that they just shouldn't go to those kinds of places at all, lest they become corrupted. Visiting a Nickelodeon at all was seen as kind of asking for trouble, or causing yourself to be put into a potentially morally corrupting situation. In other words, the space of the Nickelodeon theater was starting to be regarded as a moral battleground, as a physical place. And for many religious Americans, the Nickelodeon was considered simply too far gone, too morally corrupt and corrupting to be saved at all. They urged their members to stay away from those places and instead to pursue more uplifting forms of entertainment, such as participation in some of the new sports that were rapidly rising in popularity, like basketball or football. So by the 1910s, savvy entrepreneurs had seen that there was a big opportunity to make money from films, and they realized that feature films, longer films that were going to themselves be the primary attraction and entertainment to bring people into a theater, those started to be seen as the way of the future. Vaudeville was gradually on its way out. Movies were now suddenly taking something more like their modern form. The first American feature films were made around 1912. This really was the death knell of the kinetoscope. Those short 1 or 2 minute films were really now on their way out, because much longer and more complex feature films were becoming the standard draw to movie theaters. Perhaps unsurprisingly, religion then was a common subject for early feature films, because religious films had the benefit of a built-in audience and a deep pool of grand or epic narratives that could be mined and reimagined and presented in the new movie format. If religious audiences could simply be convinced to get over their fears about the moral corruption that might happen at a Nickelodeon, they just might actually find something that they could love at the movies, and filmmakers were willing to take that risk. Early French filmmakers had experimented with religious subject matter almost from the very beginning, depicting specific scenes from the life of Jesus, especially his crucifixion, or scenes from the lives of popular Catholic saints. In the United States, things were a little slower to develop, but in 1912, the film From the Manger to the Cross marked a major landmark moment in religion and film. Filmed on location in Egypt and in the Ottoman province that was then called Palestine, which would later become the nation of Israel, the 72-minute movie From the Manger to the Cross told the story of the life of Jesus from his birth to his death. With lavish costumes, a huge cast of characters, dazzling special effects, and stunning on-location cinematography, the movie made the life of Jesus into a dazzling epic film that played out like a series of moving paintings, or tableaux vivants. One of the most memorable scenes depicted Jesus walking on water to greet his disciples, using some of the most cunning special effects of the time to make Robert Henderson Bland, who portrayed Jesus, appear to perform an actual miracle on the screen right in front of the viewers. The way the film depicted the violence and the deep emotion of Jesus' crucifixion also made for some very memorable scenes and moving scenes for audiences. In the UK, that movie was perceived as somewhat controversial. It was seen as profiteering inappropriately off of religion, but the movie received a very warm reception from audiences and critics in the United States. Eventually, it would go on to earn more than $1 million at the box office, which was a very sizable sum for a movie at that time. Just a couple of years later, Jesus would make another major appearance in a film that would turn out to be one of the most influential and controversial films of all time. In 1915, the director D.W. Griffith released one of the biggest films in early Hollywood history. It was called The Birth of a Nation. With an eye-wateringly long runtime of 2 hours and 5 minutes, Griffith's epic film was one of the most ambitious projects in film history up to that time. It was one of Hollywood's first true big-budget blockbuster epics, with its very long runtime, glossy special effects, massive cast, and sweeping dramatic story set in turbulent historical times. The film was so popular and drew so many people to movie theaters, it would go on to become the first movie ever shown at the White House to the President of the United States, when Woodrow Wilson, his cabinet, and his family received a private screening of the film. Today, the film's technical achievements and its place in cinematic history forces us to reckon with some very harsh realities about movies in America, in particular with the harsh realities of white supremacy in America at the dawn of the 20th century. And that's because in its over 2 hours of runtime, The Birth of a Nation depicted the rise of the Ku Klux Klan as a historic, heroic American epic. Set in the American South during Reconstruction in the years, in other words, immediately following the Civil War, the movie presented an unwavering white supremacist view of what was then the recent past. Using white actors in blackface, the movie depicted African Americans who had only recently been freed from slavery as violent predators intent on destroying the peace and stability of white society in the South. The Ku Klux Klan were depicted in the film as elegant, noble, honorable Christian heroes who bring peace to the land through their campaigns of racial violence. The film's connection to religion is made clear throughout, but it becomes most obvious at the very end of the movie, when the glowing face of Jesus appears floating in the sky. The film's visual logic is painfully clear. It suggests that Jesus is on the side of the KKK, and that he approves of their actions in the film. This film is important to mention, I think, as a relic of the entanglement of religion and white supremacy in America at that time in history. It ultimately also demonstrates that any discussion of Hollywood's early history with religion would be incomplete without a simultaneous discussion of its depictions of race. Filmmakers were not always explicit, as D.W. Griffith, in glorifying white supremacy, but the popularity of Birth of a Nation, alongside that of films like From the Manger to the Cross, established unspoken standards for future depictions of Jesus on movie screens. In the more than 100 years since these films were released, depictions of Jesus have tended to follow very similar patterns established by these early portrayals. More specifically, Jesus has almost always been depicted as embodying American Christian ideals of white masculinity. And I could and probably should make a whole video just about depictions of Jesus through time in movies. But what this incident teaches us is that from the beginning, religion and race and movies were all mingled together in American society. Hollywood is a pretty complicated term, right? It, on the one hand, refers to a neighborhood in Los Angeles. But in the first decades of the 20th century, Hollywood was also starting to become a more general term used to describe a particular style of films made at studios located in Los Angeles. These films eventually established Southern California as a new epicenter of style and influence in American culture. So, in short, what I'm arguing here is that Hollywood as we know it today was largely created from the 1910s to the 1930s by just a handful of major studios that were mostly based in Southern California. Some of the most important of these studios were MGM, or Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, Universal, Warner Brothers, and Columbia Pictures, all of which still operate today in some capacity or another. These new Hollywood films were primarily feature films. Feature films were meant to be the main attraction that would get people to come into a movie theater. They were usually more than 70 minutes long, and the one film was intended to be the primary source of entertainment. So rather than paying a nickel to watch a bunch of movies, the rise of feature films urged people to pay higher and higher admission fees to see just one specific film. And the idea proved very popular, and so the theaters that concentrated their efforts on showing feature films started to become much more lucrative and nicer than Nickelodeon theaters. In other words, movie theaters during this period started to go upmarket. They started to open in fancier neighborhoods, and theater operators started competing with each other by making their seats more comfortable, or by putting fancy red carpets on their floors in the lobby or in their aisles, trying to give their audiences a more comfortable and enticing theater experience, to make the whole thing a little classier than Nickelodeons ever were. By the 1920s, movie theaters were becoming truly impressive spaces and very comfortable places, even for middle-class or upper-class Americans. Some theaters started to be described as movie palaces, and these movie palaces went to elaborate lengths to be the most dazzling environment in which people could watch movies. Movie palaces were comfortable structures built entirely for the purpose of showcasing the exciting new films coming out of those big Hollywood studios. Some theaters started decorating their interiors and exteriors in elaborately themed ways. There were ancient Egyptian themed theaters that tried to look like ancient Roman temples. One of the most famous of the movie palaces that still exists today is Grauman's Chinese Theater, which hosted the premiere of many movies in the golden era of Hollywood, but also played host to premieres of movies like Star Wars in 1977, and it still hosts movie premieres to this very day. Basically what I'm saying is that by the 1920s, Hollywood really was starting to arrive in American culture, and thousands of these fancy theaters began to open around the country. Going to a movie in a movie palace or a movie theater had become now one of the most popular and lucrative forms of entertainment in America. People were paying per film now to watch just one movie in a comfy theater with red carpets and curtains and all the latest technologies. Hollywood movies were now also starting to innovate in their use of the star system. Basically, at many studios, creative personnel were put under long-term contracts. Studios would enter these long-term contracts with actors, directors, and other creative technicians. And these stars would agree to work with just one studio for all of their films, and then in return, the studio agreed to really quite lucrative deals to promote and distribute the creative work of these film technicians. So people now were flocking to films just to see their favorite star. Film production in America was becoming largely centralized and concentrated. It was taking place primarily now on studio lots in Los Angeles. And the invention of Hollywood from a business perspective was really all about vertical integration. Studio heads usually began their careers as Nickelodeon operators, then sought to control more and more aspects of the production, distribution, and exhibition of films. Eventually, the studio system became a well-oiled machine, and most studios owned the long-term rights to the creative personnel who made films. They owned the production and distribution companies that actually made films into things that could be shipped around the country, and most studios now operated large chains of theaters around the country where they exclusively showed their own films. It was outstanding as far as vertical integration goes. And the tie to religion here is really subtle, but I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I really don't have a great argument here, but it's just something really, really fascinating to note, because I'd like you to guess what nearly all of those major Hollywood studios had in common. And the answer is that nearly all of the biggest studios in Hollywood, the kinds of studios that established Hollywood as one of America's major centers of cultural influence, all of them were, or at least nearly all of them, were founded by Jewish American entrepreneurs. Jewish American entrepreneurs were early adopters and early innovators in the film business, and their unique contributions helped create Hollywood and what we think of as the movies as they exist today. So to give you an example of why I think we need to think seriously about the role of Judaism in the creation of Hollywood, I want to tell you a little bit about the life of Louis B. Mayer, the founder and head of MGM Studios. His life story is broadly similar to the stories of a lot of other major figures that come from the early days of Hollywood. Louis B. Mayer was born in 1884 in the town of Mir in what was then part of the Russian Empire and what is now the nation of Belarus. He grew up in an extremely poor family, and like most Eastern European Jews, they were forced to live in segregated ethnic enclaves. Anti-Semitism was becoming more and more violent in the Russian Empire during this time, so the Mayer family decided to flee their home and settled in New Brunswick, Canada. In Canada, the family was still very, very poor, and Louis actually had to quit school around the 6th grade to help with his father's scrap metal business. Eventually, as a young adult, Louis would move to Boston, Massachusetts, and within just a couple of years, he saved up enough money to buy an old burlesque theater, basically a rundown stripper bar in a bad part of town. He renovated it, he turned it into a Nickelodeon theater, and that theater was so wildly successful that Louis was able to open a few more. And a few years later, he was able to move to Los Angeles and found a movie studio as a vertical integration play. He thought if he could make and then show his own movies, he would have much greater control over the product and ultimately could make more profit as a business person. Mayer is a good candidate to be considered the first, or at least one of the first, true Hollywood movie moguls. Eventually, he amassed a huge fortune and a vast media empire that included production studios, film distribution companies, and a network of theaters all across the country. He would go on to become the first American ever to earn a salary of more than $1 million a year. And at one point, he was the highest paid CEO in the entire country, which is a remarkably impressive rise for a Jewish immigrant kid from the Russian Empire. MGM Films eventually helped create the very notion of what we now understand as the American dream, and they helped create many of the Hollywood tropes and ideas that we still encounter in movies today. Apple pies and picket fences, happy endings for the good-looking couple, hard work that reaps real rewards, honesty and plucky goodwill. These are just some of the characteristics of MGM films that became Hollywood cliches precisely because of how powerful and resonant they were with American audiences. Mayer also helped create some of Hollywood's first true stars. helping launch the careers of figures whose names are still recognizable in some circles to movie buffs. Mayer's stars included people like Greta Garbo, Buster Keaton, Clark Gable, and Judy Garland. He oversaw MGM during the production of such classic films as The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, which might hold the title for highest grossing movie of all time, depending on how you count. MGM had a reputation for creating folksy, sentimental movies, and Mayer really knew how to appeal to people's warm and fuzzy feelings about America, particularly if those people happened to be white, middle-class Christians. To uphold its folksy reputation, Mayer insisted on carefully managing and curating the personal lives and appearance of his stars. He wanted them to appear morally upright and squeaky clean at all times. He told them where to eat, where to shop, whom to date or not to date, and so on and so on and so on. He wanted his stars to embody middle-class American ideals whenever they were out in the public spotlight. And that spotlight kept getting brighter and brighter as Hollywood films were increasing in popularity during the first couple of decades of the 20th century. It's worth saying here that some stars, probably most notably Judy Garland, would later go on to describe her relationship with Mayer as psychologically and perhaps even physically abusive because of the intense pressure she was put under to look and act like a shiny, happy, all-American girl all the time. Like many Jewish Americans of the time, Mayer primarily seems to have wanted to be considered both fully Jewish and also fully American. He seems not to have wanted his Jewishness to be a barrier to inclusion in broader American society. After leaving his strictly observant Orthodox Jewish family's home, Mayer became much more casual about religious observance, at least from an outside view. Throughout his life, he belonged to a temple in Los Angeles, but it seems that he rarely attended services, maybe apart from the high holidays. What he did do was become a pretty active fundraiser and philanthropist for Jewish causes, raising money for Jewish refugee organizations, Jewish relief organizations, and other sorts of causes. What's so interesting to me about Mayer's story is that it reveals an important tension or an important dynamic in the early relationships between religion and film in Hollywood. Basically, the situation was that studios were being led primarily by Jewish filmmakers, Jewish business people, but they were making movies for an audience that was primarily made up of Protestant Christians. And there's a few notable results from this odd dynamic or this odd tension. One is that there's a startling absence in early films of Jewish characters and Jewish ideas. Hollywood films almost never depicted Jewish characters or Jewish ideas, at least explicitly. Plenty of films depicted the Holy Land or depicted stories from the Bible, but it was very rare at the time to find movies that told Jewish stories from the perspective of Jewish characters, or that showed Jewish holidays being celebrated by fictional American families, or that sort of thing. So Jewishness was almost under the radar in early Hollywood films. There weren't a lot of explicit portrayals of Judaism. But on the other side of things, flagrant anti-Semitism was also comparatively rare in early Hollywood films, even though American society at the time was often openly anti-Semitic and hostile to Jewish people. There were comparatively few examples of explicitly Jewish villains in Hollywood films, for example. And the lack of explicitly Jewish films or Jewish characters contrasts pretty sharply with the many depictions in early Hollywood films about Christian topics or themes or stories or characters or values. As I've previously mentioned, there were movies about the life of Jesus almost as soon as there were movies at all, and it was not uncommon to see Christian leaders such as pastors or priests depicted in early films. So I find the MGM story and this discussion of Judaism and Christianity in early Hollywood particularly fascinating, because so many of Hollywood's depictions about what it meant to be religious, or what it meant to be American, or what it meant to be white, were curated by Jewish people who were excluded from the mainstream of what it meant to be American. We need to think about what the Jewish influence might have been, or what that might imply for these depictions of early religion. In 1927, the first sound film, or talkie, was released, and that finally brought motion pictures and recorded sounds together in the seamless way that audiences had been craving since the days of magic lantern and phonograph shows. These new films were called talkies because they allowed audiences to hear what characters were saying, not just to hear music playing in the background or like a weird phonograph recording that was supposed to go along with the action. In short, by the late 1920s, films had finally become the movies. Hollywood had emerged as one of the most important centers of American cultural production. Theaters had become mostly morally acceptable places. Nearly everyone in America was now going to the movies as a form of entertainment, even very religious people. So some of the old moral concerns about film just fizzled into the dust of history. And people's sincere religious concerns about some of this stuff looks really odd and quaint from today's perspective. But some of the concerns of religious people that were raised about film in its earliest days would never really go away. Religious people in many ways are often still deeply concerned about how the images shown on a movie screen might excite the wrong feelings in viewers, just like they were back in the days of Carmencita and the kinetoscope. One of the subtle ways that films today can try to appeal to a religious audience is through the type of content that they avoid showing on screen. Basically what I'm saying is, if you want Christian conservatives or Jewish conservatives or Muslim conservative audiences to pay attention to your movie, you're probably not going to be including a graphic sex scene in that movie, because those kinds of communities have had concerns about spicy content in films since the 1890s. Much of the religious emphasis today focuses on encouraging people to become more savvy individual consumers of media. Religious leaders today aren't necessarily warning against the dangers of watching movies in general. They can take it for granted that most of their people are watching movies, but what they do is frame the choices that people make as morally significant. So for many religious filmgoers, this now takes the form of following very specific guidelines about the kind of content that they will or will not watch in a film. Many religious Americans feel like they shouldn't watch movies that contain too many swear words, or that contain violence of particular types, or films that contain nudity of particular types, particularly sex scenes. So along these lines, the theater space itself is still in some ways regarded as a battleground by many religious people. Many religious Americans treat movie theaters as, at best, morally neutral and harmless places, but more often as morally corrupt or corrupting places, because they are showing all different kinds of movies at the same time. They're showing good stuff alongside stuff that these groups find problematic. And this means that when an overtly religious movie gets shown on screens in a regular movie theater, and it actually manages to draw an audience, this is often perceived as a substantial victory for religion over the forces that supposedly don't want religion to appear in movies at all. By flocking to the theater to see those kinds of movies, people can imagine their viewership as something religiously significant and also productively countercultural at the same time, right? I think the basic idea I'm trying to get across here is that it seems weird today to think about Nickelodeons as corrupt moral places, but a lot of religious viewers still today will say, well, those people think that God has no place in the movies, and we're going to show them and prove them wrong by our entire community buying out a showing of a movie that we think is great. We're going to bring God back into the theater to reclaim that space as a religious space rather than as like the culturally neutral, or at best culturally neutral space that it normally is. So for my money, I think the question of religiousness in Hollywood is still a really complex thing. It's very much up for debate. Is Hollywood religious or secular? I mean, I think it's neither and it's both. Hollywood does seem to have its own distinct values and to depict its own weird kind of secularism. Overt religion is oddly absent from many movies, even though it's an important part of human life. And yet, Hollywood also intentionally aims to appeal to a broad cross-section of mainstream American tastes, which means that Hollywood tends to skew pretty heavily toward white and Christian tastes because American society in general tends to skew white and Christian numerically and in terms of cultural influence. It's simply the case that white Christians, especially white Protestant Christians, make up a majority numerically, and I think they hold a lot of cultural influence in American society. So Hollywood is always doing this dance of trying to appeal to their tastes, but also not alienate other potential audiences. And, along those lines, I think it's worth noting that because of the cultural impact of one religious community, or broadly one religious community in America, issues of basic representation are still a pretty big deal for many religious minority communities, including Jewish people, including Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Mormons and others. These communities still have to be concerned about basic stuff like how they get represented on screen. And it's really only relatively recently that Hollywood has shown much interest at all with taking insider views from minority communities into account in any serious sort of way. So, I appreciate you sticking with me to the end. This video has gone way too long. I hope this slightly quick history of Hollywood will make you think a little differently about maybe what it means to watch a movie and why religious people might have some of the concerns that they still do. For now, that's all for this video. Have a good day, go do good things, and I'll see you next time.